Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 25 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is the object of charity. We're still looking at charity itself. As I pointed out, that these are rather long sections. So this is another one that's 12 articles long. Next will be the ordering of charity, which is 13 articles long. So I will try to go through as quickly but as thoroughly as I can. So the first article is about the extent of charity. What is the extent of charity? Is charity directed to God alone, or does it include the love of neighbor? Now, if you recall, charity is living in enjoying God for God's own sake. It's an enjoyment of God. It's loving God for God's own sake. It seems to be that the direct object of charity is God, right? So it's hard to take God out of that equation and still have charity if God isn't in it, right? It's an essential element of charity is God, since God is the object. But St. Thomas points out from the first letter of John, this commandment we have from God, that he should love God, that he who loveth God love also his brothers. Right, so Jesus brings this strongly to love God who you do not see. You must love your brother who you do see. Right, it's kind of baked into the Christian theology from the beginning. So it opens the door for the idea that it could be extended. Right, it could be an extension of that love. Now, when we love our neighbor to the degree that they are in God, right? So it's not loving our neighbor for our neighbor's sake, it's loving our neighbor for God's sake. So this is different than a secular humanitarianism, humanism. This is specific, right? This is love of neighbor through God, right? Because your neighbor is in God, right? St. Thomas even points out that this is specifically the same act, right? So when we love our neighbor, what we are really doing is loving God in our neighbor, right? God kind of hides himself in plain sight in the bodies of our neighbors, particularly those neighbors who are in the lowest positions, right? The most unlovable is where God hides himself. Not necessarily just in the rich and the beautiful people, but in the ones with mental illnesses and addictions. And this is where he hides himself, and this is where we find him. So loving the neighbor is, in a way, loving God. It's not two separate acts. The love of God and the love of neighbor. You're loving God in the neighbor, right? So this is somewhat different. The next article is kind of a fun one. Should you love charity out of charity, right? Another way of saying it, do you love love, right? There's a lot of people who love being in love, but what they usually mean by it is some type of they love flirting, or they love the infatuation of dating, something like that. But this is truly, do you love love, right? And St. Thomas says, yes, you should love love, right? You should love charity out of charity. Now, why is this? He's using St. Augustine here. He that loves his neighbor must, in consequence, love itself. Right, this is where he's getting it from. Well, if you think about it, right, kind of meditate on it. If you now love God and you love your neighbor, this should give you some sense that there's some pleasure in it, right? There's a goodness in it, right? You kind of can take a step back from this and see the big picture, right? Love of God and love of neighbor, and say, I love that I love God and I love my neighbor, right? this isn't something that I resent. This is something that I love, right? This is when I love God and I love my neighbor. This is a wonderful thing which I love, right? This is different than a kind of deontology where you have a duty to do it, even if it's miserable to do, even if it's against your self-interest, even when it's an awful thing, right? Because you do it out of goodwill, right? In deontology, but out of Thomism, loving God and loving neighbor should become something that you love, right? you love doing it. An interesting perspective. The next article will probably make some people, especially dog and cat lovers, a little bit upset, but St. Thomas says, can we love irrational creatures? Right, well, who are irrational creatures? Well, we're not talking about human beings, and we're not talking about angels, right? Because angels and humans are rational beings. God is a rational being. So we're talking about animals, right? Other non-human animals. And St. Thomas says, well, charity treats others as you treat yourself, right? The love of neighbor as oneself is an idea of friendship. So you will the good of another, right? You're willing the good of another with charity for their own sake, right? You're willing the good of another for their own sake. And St. Thomas points out that animals neither have, they don't have free will, therefore they cannot do good and they cannot do evil, right? We might say good dog or bad dog, but really a dog is just being a dog. So because of this, to will the good of it, I guess you could wish good health, right? A good time, but what we really mean by good here is, an excellence of some kind, right? And aspiring to an excellence. Well, irrational animals can never, they're already there, right? They are already what they are and what they are going to be from the moment they are born to the moment they die. They are purely their own nature, and they never deviate from it because they are not rational and they do not have free will and they can't deviate from it, right? So to will that a dog may be more fully a dog is kind of a ridiculous idea, right? Because it already is fully a dog. Willing that a horse may be more fully a horse, it is fully a horse, right? But you can will a human be more fully human because we can negate our own nature, right? We can negate our own purpose and our own being, right, by sin, right? We can violate it, but animals cannot violate it, right? So they always live it, right, perfectly. Another way of looking at it would be, well, you can have friendships with animals, metaphorically speaking, right? And this is probably what many people do. Your dog is very happy to see you when you get home, and you're very happy to see your dog, and your dog is your buddy, right? There's a sharing of a life together, right? In some ways, you share a life together, but not as equals, right? If you run out of food, your cat will eat you. If there's a limited amount of food, the dog isn't going to share its food with you. It's the dog is going to be a dog. In some ways, we anthropomorphize animals a bit more than probably is what's healthy, right? A dog is a dog, a cat is a cat, a horse is a horse. They are not really our true companions, as much as we sometimes think that they are, right? Doesn't mean, metaphorically they are, but, in a real way, they're not really full companions, not that way. The last one is animals do not have everlasting happiness. So this is like with the first one, willing the good of another, willing eternal, everlasting happiness for an animal doesn't really make a lot of sense, because they are not able to enjoy everlasting happiness, right? Classical understanding would be, upon death, the animal soul dissipates upon death, right? Because they were not saved with the resurrection, so they're not going to heaven. Then the alternative would be hell, and to send all animals to hell would be a terrible thing, right? And you say, well, you did not accept Jesus into your life, therefore you're going to hell. Well, that's a heck of a thing to do to a cat who didn't have free will. So their souls dissipate upon death, right? Maybe in a Platonic way, right? In heaven there is catness and dogness and horseness and all the other things, and they return to the great hoarseness or catness in the mind of God, which exists forever, right? But not in a particular way. Now, when you get to heaven, will you see your dog or your cat? Well, everything created exists in the mind of God, and in heaven we also exist within the mind of God. In heaven, could you see your dog or cat again? Who knows? I don't know, but it would not be in a particular way, in essence, the same way as it would be with a rational human soul. That would be the orthodox teaching on that, I think. Right. St. Thomas does say, and I took his exact quote so that I don't get it at all wrong, and you can make your own judgments based on it. He says, nevertheless, we can love irrational creatures out of charity. So we can love irrational creatures, right? If we regard them as a good thing that we desire for others, wishing for their preservation to God's honor and man's use. Thus, too, does God love them out of charity. I think that is a very reasonable answer, right? That shouldn't offend too many people, I hope. Why would we love that cat or that dog? Well, part of the reason is because of what it means to somebody else, right? So if it's your neighbor's dog, because you love your neighbor and your neighbor is so fond of that dog, you love your neighbor's dog because you love your neighbor, right? So this makes some sense, right? For the good things that it does for others, right? But you also can wish for their preservation, because God created them. They exist to honor God. They also exist to serve man, right? So it's kind of a twofold, right? Why do these animals exist to begin with? Well, to serve man and to honor God, right? Therefore, we can love them, right? And he says even God loves them, right? God loves the irrational animals out of charity. Right? Well, that seems quite reasonable to me, right? What it does, though, is it takes away the anthropomorphizing of animals, right? We're not turning animals into persons, but within their own nature, we can love them for what they are, right? Which I think is a healthy thing, is to love an animal for what it is, not for what you want it to be or what it, right? To fill that empty hole in my heart, it's not that. It's loving it for what it is. Can you show charity to oneself? Well, yes, you can show charity to oneself. Now, this is written in two ways. In terms of general friendship, man cannot be a friend to himself, because friendship creates a unity, right? There's a unity. Loving another through friendship is to hope for another the good in which you have, right? That you want for another. You love your neighbor as yourself, right? Well, if you are yourself, right, then you cannot have friendship with yourself, right? There is already a unity of being there. General friendship requires a unity of two, right? A unity of two or more, but it can't be a unity of one, because it's, by definition, it's already unity, right? Somebody once said that to me many years ago. They go, "Oh, yeah, you know, a friend you need to have a friendship with yourself." And I thought, what on earth does that mean, to have a friendship with yourself? And I asked other people, I said, have you ever heard of this idea of a friendship with yourself? Doesn't the idea of friendship mean that there's another person involved? It's kind of like marrying yourself. Like, I'm not sure what that means, right? Anyway, that's the difference between psychologists and theologians, right? We think differently. But in the second way, maybe there is a friendship with oneself. Loving others because they are in God. Now, you are in God, right? So if you love Bob across the street because they are in God, right? So you show charity to Bob in order to show charity to God, right? I don't know if I said that right. So you show love and charity to Bob in order to show charity to God, right? So in that regard, that would be proper friendship, right? So, well, if you also exist in God, then showing charity to yourself because of love of God works, right? Then you can show charity to yourself. But it's in relation to God, not in relationship to yourself. The next one is, can we show charity towards our bodies, right? And this we look at in Article 12 here. This all comes from Augustine, so this is why it's being raised. Augustine said we should show charity towards our bodies, right? And St. Thomas unfolds it in two ways. One, in terms of nature, right? We should love our bodies because God created our bodies, right? Our bodies are good. Going back to the book of Genesis, and God looked at it and said, it is very good, right? Looking at creation, it's very good. So therefore, we don't look at the body as evil like the Gnostics or the Manichaeans or something like this. Catholic theology is the body is good. Our nature is good. God has given us this nature. Now, our nature and our bodies is also a result of original sin, right? There's also an element of original sin in there, right? The shame of being naked, the original coming from the fall. They covered themselves, and then God gives them clothing, right? So there's... we should be aware of the sin. I think if we wanted to say, well, what would that mean today? We can't really put this back on the 13th century. But, things like nudist colonies or something like this, right? We shouldn't be flaunting our bodies, right? Why do we wear clothes? Well, one, to protect us from the elements, and two, out of humility, because of the fall, right? That's kind of a classical understanding of why we wear clothes, right? And in that humility from the fall, we hopefully, depending on the person, prevent our brothers and sisters from lusting. Imagine strapping hot bodies walking around naked. This could create lust. So we dress modestly, right? So there's an element of modesty. So should you love our bodies? Yes, by the nature and by means of its creation, but we should also be aware of the sin of punishment, which might cause us to recall the fall and to act with humility and modesty, right? So this, I think, would be St. Thomas would agree with this today. Again, I don't think when he was writing he was even thinking of nudist colonies or something like that, but that would apply. The next article is, should we show charity towards sinners? And there's a lot of good examples at the beginning of, especially from the Old Testament, where God has said, to these bad people, these bad groups of people, destroy them all, right? Just don't let a single woman, child, or animal survive, right? Because they have violated it, right? So isn't this a sign that we should not show mercy to sinners, right? Cut them down, right? That's the idea. And St. Thomas says, no, that's not really our approach. Thankfully, he says that, right? He says, in terms of our neighbor, the sinner is our neighbor, just like the saint is our neighbor, right? The sinner is our neighbor. We should love them, right? This is true. And in terms of their nature as a human being, the rational soul, made in the image and likeness of God, we should love that, right? It's loving the nature God put in them, right? Because remember, charity is loving our neighbor for the sake of God, not for their own sake. So, in that regard, an element of the divine exists, right? Persists in their nature. So we must love that in them. Now, in terms of their guilt, we do not have to love their guilt. As they sometimes say, hate the sin, love the sinner, right? Yeah, that would exist, right? We make fun of that sometimes, but that would be a good Thomistic approach to this. And we don't even love the sinner for their own sake. We love the sinner because they were because of who created them, right? Because of their nature. And what should we have? What feelings should, if we have charity towards their nature, what is the approach to their guilt, their sin? And he says, perfect hatred. Right? Perfect hatred. We should not like it at all, right? And this would be what would be charitable, right? The charitable thing. If you love your neighbor because they exist in God, this would cause you to hate their sin even more. Why? Because you want what is best for them, and you want them to be more Christ-like, right? More God-like, more in God. It would make that easier to love them, right? That would be true. St. Thomas says, for it is our duty to hate in the sinner this being a sinner, and to love in him this being a man capable of bliss. And this is to love him truly, out of charity, for God's sake. This is wonderful. This is very wonderful. I heard something from Jordan Peterson the other day talking about something like this, that the church needs to call people to repentance, not finger-wagging morality, he says, but begging people to be saved because you don't want them to burn, right? This would be a similar thing, right? Is we hate that in the sinner, which makes them a sinner, but we love in them what's capable of bliss, right? It's on one side you see something that's heavy and dark and awful, and on the other side it's light and there's peace and there's joy, right? And these other virtues and gifts that come with charity, right? And you want what's, on one side you have the snake, and the other side you have gold, right? You want them to choose the gold, not the snake, right? As I say, choose the bread, not the asp, right? Using a scriptural image. Can sinners love themselves? And to this, can sinners show charity to themselves? And in this, St. Thomas says no, right? If you're in venial sin, then yes, right? But if you're in mortal sin, then no, right? No, then no. But if you would know people in mortal sin, you would say, well, they seem to love themselves. Sometimes, perhaps they love themselves too much, right? And I think this is an interesting theological point, to reflect on. And most people, I think, they think of themselves as good, right? They think of themselves as good, and they think of the choices they make as good choices, right? Or they're choices that are the best option for them, right? Even if they're a drug dealer and all these things, in their mind, they think that they are making the best choice that they can make given their circumstances in their life, right? They are under the impression that they are choosing the good, and they have convinced themselves that they have chosen the good. They have convinced themselves that they are good. The problem is this is not necessarily reality, right? They might have a false opinion about themselves, right? They believe something about a version of themselves, or an apparition of themselves, a fantasy about themselves. But this is not true, right? So in their mind, themselves in their mind, right? Their image of themselves, they love, right? The image. But the reality of who they are, they do not love. But they have blinded themselves to the reality of who they are. Because if they could see who they are, they would change, right? Imagine the drug dealer seeing the world through God's eyes for a minute, seeing the consequences of their actions, right, and the effect it has on people, destroying lives and doing terrible things, right? God, who loves us perfectly, and sees us suffering, and sees you as some of the cause of that suffering. They wouldn't love that person. They wouldn't love them. But what they see is a different version of themselves. They see the best version of themselves. There was a study a couple of decades ago, and something like 80% of people said that they believed that they were going to heaven, but their friends were not. Right? So everybody thinks they're going to heaven, but not their friends. Well, it's a good chance that you're an awful lot like your friends. Probably. Now, should we show charity towards our enemies, right? Our enemies aren't always sinners, right? Sometimes they're just different. Think of St. Philip Neri and St. Charles Borromeo. St. Charles Borromeo was always frustrated with Philip Neri. Here, St. Charles is trying to build up Milan, the Diocese of Milan, and he'd get all these priests, and he had a priest shortage. Get priests, they'd be almost ready to be ordained, and then they would leave and join St. Philip Neri at the oratories, and it's like, you're stealing all my priests. Leave my priests alone. I need them myself. And here you have two saints, and they sometimes were at odds with one another, both trying to reform the church, but with limited resources, sometimes in competition with one another too. Now, can you show charity towards your enemies? Yes, right? Yes and no, right? So in the first way is to love them because they are our enemies. This is a tough one, because this would be a good discussion. Well, doesn't Jesus command us to love our enemies? So to love them because they are our enemies? Well, in some ways, yes, because that's what Christ commanded, right? That's our duty. But what St. Thomas points out in the objections, in his response to the objections, is to love someone who is your enemy is perverse in some ways. To love someone who wants to destroy you, somebody who would like to kill you, right? Maybe think of Russia and Ukraine, right? For Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to love Russia because he is his enemy. He's trying to kill the man and kill his family and kill his wife and his children and to destroy his nation. To love him because he's trying to kill him and to destroy his nation would be perverse, right? That's not why you're going to love him, right? Jesus couldn't be asking us to love him because of the evil he's doing, right? This goes back to, can you love a sinner, right? Well, you can't love a sinner because of their sin, right? That wouldn't make any sense at all. That's not the reason why you love them. You love them because of their nature, right? Number 2, right? Because they are our neighbor, you love them. Because they are made in the image and likeness of God. Because they exist in God, right? For these reasons, yes, you love your enemies. Just like you love all your neighbors, right? You love all human beings because of this element right here. Now, there are sometimes other reasons why you love your neighbors as well. And this, St. Thomas points out in number 3, which is, should we love them in a special way, right? Should we show them charity especially directed towards them? And this answer was yes. And this is a little bit like the Jesus commanding us to love our enemies. We can love them in a special way because we want them to have a conversion of heart, right? Because we don't want them to be our enemy, right? It's not a general kindness, but to say, I want you to change and I want us to be good, right? This is in a special way, right? This is like a doctor treating a person with cancer, right? It comes with specialization to heal the broken, right? To heal the sick. This is the image here. A special kind of love, right? When I was with the Native Americans, one of the things they would say is, remember the faces of our enemies. Remember the faces of our enemies so that we may go back to the sacred fire and pray to their ancestors to change their hearts, right? So what is the Native American approach to enemies? Remember them so that we can pray to God to change their hearts, right? This is how we should treat our neighbor, right? The natives have certainly had their Christian influences. I don't know how much of this came from ancient native theology and how much of this is Christianity saturating the culture. But I think that's very, take out great fire, talk out ancestors. But if you look at the essence of it, pray to God to change the hearts of our enemies. This is a very good thing, right? This is good. Okay. Do we have to show signs of charity towards our neighbor? Does this have to be manifested? In which way do we show charity towards our enemies? And this, I think, is particularly interesting because it's probably not what most Catholics would think or Christians would think. St. Thomas says, it is not necessary for salvation to show signs of charity towards our enemies, right? If this person is your enemy, you do not have to go out of your way. Salvation does not require it to be nice to them. There's a difference between showing charity and being nice to them. Willing the good of another, yes. Doesn't mean you have to buy him coffee and this. Not for salvation, right? Now, St. Therese, she was known for doing this, right? The nun that used to drive her crazy, she would sit right next to her and be extra nice to her as a sign. In some ways, she was her enemy. She might be a saint in heaven too, right? The annoying nun might be a saint in heaven too, but in some ways, she was her enemy. But you don't have to for salvation, right? It doesn't hurt, but you don't have to. But what you do have to do, this is interesting, I think, is you must be ready to come to their aid in the case of an urgent situation, right? If they need you, you have to be there for them, right? You don't have to buy them a coffee, but when they need you, you have to be there for them. Yeah. I think that's fair. Right? You don't have to, sometimes we say this, you don't have to like your enemies, but you do have to love them, right? This is perfectly in line with question 25, article 9, right? You don't have to like your enemies, but you do have to love them. St. Thomas uses Proverbs, if thy enemy be hungry, give him to eat, and if thirsty, give him to drink, right? Give them what they need to survive, but you don't have to go out of your way to try to serve them, right? You don't have to go out of your way. Could be a good lesson for some people with difficult families too, right? You should always love your family. It doesn't mean you need to persistently be the doormat, though, right? But you do have to love them. The last ones are kind of interesting here. It's getting a bit more supernatural. Should we love the angels? Should we show charity to the angels? And St. Thomas says yes, yes. In the resurrection, men shall be as angels in God, angels of God in heaven, right? The resurrection, men shall be as angels. Therefore, the angels in some ways are our neighbors. Since they are our neighbors, they are our friends. Right? In heaven, they will be, we'll be buddies, right? We'll be neighbors. So in that regard, yes, we can show charity towards them, all right? And we're loving them because of God, right? Through God. They are the messenger of God, right? Angels are messengers. They're the messengers of God. If you love God, you love God's messengers, right? In their nature, you have to love them as well. And they also have rational souls, right? They are intellectual, they are rational beings, right? And we are rational beings. So in some ways, they are also our neighbors in that regard as well, right? So we can show charity towards angels, right? We want what's good for them. We want everlasting happiness with them, right? And they are our neighbor, right? So in those three regards, remember, if you go back to the beginning with irrational animals, they were not our neighbor, but the angels in some ways, in these three ways they are our neighbors. They are worthy of charity. Well, then how about the demons, right? This one's an interesting one, a bit more complicated, right? So the nature of angels is really twofold, right? St. Thomas starts off with saying, well, the nature of angels is deformed and corrupted nature, right? God made them beautiful and good, and they, through an act of the will, are deformed and corrupted in sin, right? So in that way, we don't love their nature, right? You can love human nature because there's still the potential for bliss, right? There's still potential for God's friendship. But for demons, there's no potential. They live in actuality. And their actuality is deformed and corrupted, right? So there's no need to love their nature. And then in terms of their actions, they do evil, so you don't have to love their actions, right? Remember the sinner, you love the nature, but you don't love the action, right? The sin. Here you don't have to love the nature or the action. And they can't experience everlasting goodness, and to will the good for another, right? They're unable to experience goodness. So using those three criteria set out by irrational animals, no, you can't show charity towards demons because there's no friendship there, right? But then St. Thomas points out we can love the nature of demons. You just said you can't love the nature of demons because it's corrupted and deformed. But here he's saying you can love the nature of demons even out of charity, inasmuch as we desire those spirits to endure as their natural gifts unto God's glory. That is so confusing. Right? This would be great for a conversation. What does this mean? Right? And I think what St. Thomas is doing is he's looking back at their original nature that God created, right? God created for them a good nature, and they've abandoned it. But to desire those spirits to endure as to their natural gifts unto God's glory, they can't convert, they can't change. I'm not fully sure what he means by this, other than getting an image from the book of Job, right? That the devil in the heavenly courts, trying mankind, right? That even hell kind of plays a role in the divine narrative, right? That even hell has a position, even the demons have a vocation within the divine, the divine story. Another approach would be the fact that they exist, right? The fact that they exist is a good, right? Because if they were completely evil, they would not even exist. They would be the absence of being, right? That would be true negation of all goodness. The fact that they have being is that they retain some goodness of God, but is corrupted and deformed. So, I don't know. Discuss among yourselves. That was an interesting one. And lastly, what should be shown charity, right? And in some ways we've already gone over this, right? This is coming from St. Augustine's De Doctrina Christi. So we should love God, we should love our neighbor, we should love our bodies, and we should love ourselves, right? These are the four. And we've already covered these individually, so I'm not going to go over again. I don't know why he wouldn't put this earlier and then unfolded it, but he unfolded it and then he put it together at the end of the last article. We're also going to look at this again in question 26 in the proper ordering of charity, so I'm not going to go into any more detail here. So if you want more on it, go ahead to chapter 26. We'll cover that more because St. Thomas does. So in conclusion, charity is for the love of God, and that extends to neighbor insofar as your neighbor is in God. Charity loves love, right? You love love in charity, right? Charity is towards irrational creatures in a sense, not as equals, but as for the glory of God, for God's enjoyment and for human use, right? We can love irrational beings. Charity for oneself, right? If you can love your neighbor because of your neighbor's relationship to God, then you can love yourself in terms of your relationship with God. Charity towards one's body, right? To the extent that your body is created by God and has been given a good nature, we can love our bodies, but not the sin. Charity towards sinners, right? Again, we love the sinner's nature, but we don't love the sinner's sin. Consistent. Can sinners have charity towards themselves? And the answer is really no, right? They can love an image of themselves, but they can't love themselves because it's not lovable. Now, should we show charity towards our enemies? Yes, because our enemies are our neighbors, right? And Christ has commanded us to love them, and they have the potential to be God's friends. So we can, right? And should. Do we have to show tokens of charity towards our enemies? And this is no, right? We do out of necessity, right? If they need us for something, we have to be there for them, but we don't have to go out of our way to give tokens of charity just for the sake of duty or something like that. Now, should we show charity towards angels? Yes, because they are our neighbors and we share a rational soul with them. Should we love demons? Some debate, but ultimately no, right? Because they have a deformed nature and their acts are sins, right? So we don't love their nature and we don't love their actions. And then there are 4 types of charity: to God, to neighbor, to body, and to self, right? And we're going to unpack that in question 26. So this is a long one, but I hope you enjoyed it. More on charity to come.